Chapter 1. The Crack in the Teacup. The village of Netherchipping was the sort of place where time forgot to hurry. A place where the hedgerows bloomed in strict obedience to the calendar, and the vicar's wife arranged chrysanthemums with military precision. So, when Mr. and Mrs. Allerton hosted their annual spring dinner party at Falleridge Hall, it was not merely an event. It was a social obligation, as perennial as the tulips and just as delicately judged. Guests arrived in neat succession, all within 15 minutes of the appointed hour. Coats were removed, compliments exchanged, and sherry glasses filled under the watchful gaze of Mrs. Allerton, whose smile never faltered, but whose eyes missed nothing. The drawing-room hummed with soft conversation, broken occasionally by the chime of laughter or the polite rustle of silk skirts. Miss Jane Marple sat slightly apart from the others, as was her way, not excluded, but never quite at the centre. She occupied a small armchair by the window, crocheting something indeterminate in pale blue. Her presence was unobtrusive, even forgettable. Yet her eyes, sharp and sky-coloured, moved gently from guest to guest, absorbing more than the conversation. Aloud, "There you are, Miss Marple," said Colonel Weatherby as he sank into the seat beside her. "Hiding away again?" "I find I see more from the edge," Miss Marple replied softly. "One observes things more clearly when one isn't quite in the picture." He chuckled, not quite understanding, and turned to refill his glass. The dinner bell chimed, clear and sweet, and the party shuffled toward the long oak table in the dining-room. Candles flickered in silver sconces. A floral centrepiece of hyacinths and roses perfumed the air. The seating arrangement had been chosen with care, enough to keep old grudges apart, but not so obvious as to admit they existed. To Miss Marple's right sat young Lucy Carroway, pale-faced and a touch too quiet for her 22 years. Her fiancé, Thomas Brabham, was across the table, his fingers drumming a nervous rhythm near his wineglass. His tie was a fraction askew. Small detail, but enough to catch Miss Marple's eye. To her left, Mrs. Geraldine Moffat was already on her second glass of wine, her voice a shade louder than the rest. Opposite her sat Reverend Chudley, red-cheeked and sweating slightly despite the mild spring evening. A dark thread of tension, like a hairline crack in porcelain, ran through the room. The conversation danced around innocuous topics: the vicarage garden, an upcoming charity sale, the unfortunate state of the railway timetable. But now and then something slipped. A too careful pause, a sidelong glance, an overly rehearsed laugh. It was during the fish course that something shifted. A silence fell, a peculiar silence, brittle and expectant. Mrs. Allerton had just finished a rather forced compliment about Lucy's engagement when the door to the hallway opened. But no one stood there. A breeze drifted through, unsettling the candle flames. The curtains stirred. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then Thomas Brabham cleared his throat loudly, as if to dispel the moment, and conversation resumed. Somewhat louder, a touch more frantic. Miss Marple, unmoved, sipped her soup. Her gaze lingered on Lucy, whose fingers now clenched tightly around her napkin. "Bit of a chill," Colonel Weatherby remarked. "Ought to have the draft sealed, eh, Allerton?" Yes, Mr. Allerton agreed quickly, though he hadn't seemed to notice it at all. His wife, meanwhile, was rigid in her seat, her hand resting atop her husband's, as though it had landed there by accident and forgotten how to move. Dessert arrived, lemon syllabub with fresh cream, and the moment passed. But something had entered with that wind, and it had not quite left. After dinner, in the drawing room again, conversation turned to card games and coffee. Miss Marple declined politely and returned to her window seat, her crochet work untouched. It was then, cheering the hush between laughter and a poorly played piano note, that she heard it. A step, faint but distinct, upstairs where no one had gone, where no one should be. Miss Marple's needles paused mid-air. Her head tilted, not dramatically, not enough to alarm, but inwardly something clicked. There was a presence in the house, one no one had seen, but everyone had felt, and before the week was out, someone would be dead. Chapter 2. Whispers Among the Roses. By morning, Nether Chipping had done what it always did best in the face of anything unusual. It whispered, "The Allertons." Dinner party had ended without further incident, but something had clung to the guests as they left, something unspoken, like the smell of smoke after a fire that never quite burned. The village, ever sensitive to change, now stirred with quiet speculation. At the greengrocer's, Mrs. Harbottle remarked that Lucy Carraway had looked ghastly pale last night, and wondered aloud whether the girl might be ill. Mrs. Simpkins, who always claimed second-hand knowledge from her niece's sister-in-law's gardener, said it wasn't illness, it was fear. The poor dear had barely touched her dessert. Imagine that! Lemon syllabub untouched! At the post office, Thomas Brabham was seen mailing a letter with uncharacteristic urgency. He muttered something about early post to Mrs. Cribbs, who didn't ask but later told 3 people anyway. He left his change behind. She returned it, of course, but he hadn't even noticed. By afternoon, Reverend Chudley's sermon prep had taken a sombre tone. He'd spent longer than usual in the graveyard, and when asked about it simply said, "Reflection, my dear. One must always reflect when the air thickens." No one knew quite what he meant, but it sounded suitably dramatic and was repeated, verbatim at the tea shop by 4 p.m. Meanwhile, Miss Marple sipped her lapsang souchong with deliberate calm. She had just settled in the front parlour of the vicarage for an informal visit with Mrs. Weatherby, the Colonel's wife, a woman fond of embroidery, and even fonder of scandal. "It was the oddest thing, Jane," Mrs. Weatherby said, threading a particularly stubborn needle. "That open door gave me such a turn. No one admits to opening it, not the staff, not the Allertons." Miss Marple didn't answer at first. Her fingers rested lightly on the rim of her teacup. "Sometimes," she said after a pause, "the most unsettling things are not what we see, but what we feel, and no one likes to admit to a feeling they can't explain." Mrs. Weatherby nodded, quickly. "Yes, exactly what I thought. Now, I do like Lucy Carraway, mind you, but she was clearly troubled last night, distracted, and Thomas, he practically leapt out of his chair when the wind blew in. It wasn't just the draught, I can tell you that." There was a pause, filled only by the faint clink of teaspoons and the ticking of the mantel clock. "I wonder," Miss Marple murmured, "if anyone else noticed the music stopped just before the door opened." Mrs. Weatherby blinked. "Music?" "The radio," Miss Marple said lightly. "It was playing in the hallway when I arrived. Chopin, I believe." But there was silence just before the interruption. A silence that wasn't natural. Mrs. Weatherby didn't quite follow, but she nodded politely anyway. Later that evening, a different sort of silence hovered over Falleridge Hall. Mrs. Allerton stood at the threshold of the drawing-room, staring at the place where the breeze had entered the night before. Her hand was on the frame of the door, not pushing, not pulling, just resting. Mr. Allerton, standing behind her with a drink in hand, finally spoke. "It's just the wind, Margaret." "No," she said quietly. "No, it isn't." The couple said nothing more. Upstairs, a shutter banged softly against the window frame. And in the far end of the hallway, where the light didn't quite reach, the floor creaked, but no one had walked there. Chapter 3. The napkin folded twice, and Tuesday morning the air in Nether Chipping was sharp with the scent of primroses and rumour. The Allertons' dinner party was now 2 days past, but something in the rhythm of village life remained unsettled. It wasn't the usual aftermath of a social gathering, not merely the trickle of gossip or rehashing of outfits worn and wine served. This unease clung heavier, as though something had entered the fabric of village life and gently pulled it. The threads. Miss Marple sat in the corner pew at St. Mildred's for morning prayers. Though she appeared deep in contemplation, her gaze had drifted, unmoving, yet acutely focused, across the nave to where Lucy Carroway knelt. Lucy's fingers were pressed so tightly together that her knuckles showed white. Her eyes remained closed, her lips moved, but the rhythm of her prayer was off, a silent recitation not born of peace, but fear. After the service, the vicar paused beside Miss Marple on his way out. "You found it chilly in there today, Miss Marple?" he asked with a warm smile. "Oh, no more than usual," she replied gently, "though I dare say the windows could use a polish. It's hard to see clearly through fogged glass, don't you think?" The vicar looked momentarily puzzled, then nodded and moved on. Outside the church gate, Lucy stood alone, fiddling with the strap of her handbag. Miss Marple joined her without ceremony. "My dear," she said softly, "how lovely your scarf looks against that coat. Such a gentle shade of green. Seafoam, is it?" Lucy startled slightly, her fingers stilling. "Oh, thank you. It was a gift from Thomas." "A thoughtful choice. He has good taste." Lucy offered a faint smile, but it faltered almost immediately. "Miss Marple, did you feel anything strange that night? At the Allertons?" Miss Marple let the pause stretch just long enough. "Strange is such a curious word, don't you think? Sometimes it means unfamiliar. Sometimes it means unwelcome." Lucy looked down. "I didn't sleep afterward. I kept hearing footsteps. I thought maybe it was just nerves, but I can't shake the feeling that someone was in the house." Miss Marple nodded, as if Lucy had only mentioned a misplaced umbrella. "And were you the last to leave?" "No," Lucy said quickly. "Thomas and I left together, but Reverend Chudley stayed a bit longer. I think he and Mr. Allerton were discussing repairs to the organ." Miss Marple's expression remained serene. How very conscientious of them. That afternoon she called on the vicarage again, ostensibly to return a copy of the Forsyte Saga, though the book never made it past the hallway. Miss Marple made her way, with habitual gentleness, into the drawing-room, where a tray of tea had already been laid out. "I was just remarking to Mrs. Weatherby," she said as she poured, How very odd it was the way the candle nearest Lucy Carroway flickered so violently that night. Reverend Chudley, who had just taken a seat by the hearth, glanced up. Indeed, I hadn't noticed. No. Miss Marple stirred her tea. It drew my eye, almost as though someone had passed by her chair, yet I don't recall anyone standing. The Reverend cleared his throat. Must have been the draught. That door had a mind of its own. Yes, Miss Marple said lightly. Doors often do. But it's funny, isn't it? That candle flickered, and yet the one next to Mrs. Allerton didn't move at all. She sipped without further comment. The silence that followed was not long, but it felt longer than it should have. Later that day, Miss Marple paid a quiet visit to the Allertons' cook, Mrs. Drury, under the convenient excuse of delivering a jar of plum conserve. She stayed just long enough to notice a folded white napkin on the sideboard, creased in the middle and then again at the corner. Someone left that from dinner, I expect, Mrs. Drury said with a shrug. Miss Marple touched it briefly. Folded twice, not once. Curious. Oh? Mrs. Drury blinked. Well, that's not how we do it, but sometimes guests tidy after themselves, don't they? Indeed, said Miss Marple, but most don't use perfume with bergamot in it, and this one does. Chapter 4. The Shadow in the Garden. The days following the dinner party were marked by a steady and persistent tension that even the cheerful weather could not dispel. As Miss Marple went about her quiet observations, the villagers were not so reserved in their speculations. Whispers grew louder with each passing hour, and by Thursday afternoon the scent of suspicion was thick in the air. Lucy Carroway's behaviour had become the focal point of the gossip mill. It was her pale face at the dinner table, her uncharacteristic silence, that had first caught Miss Marple's eye. But now the whispers painted her as the grieving fiancée, unravelling under the weight of her loss. The tragedy was not yet official, but to the villagers the death that had hung over the dinner party seemed an inescapable conclusion. Mrs. Allerton, who had always taken a delicate interest in young Lucy, now looked at her with a mix of pity and curiosity. It's simply dreadful, Mrs. Allerton said to Miss Marple as they stood in the flower garden the next afternoon, admiring the roses. Poor Lucy! A girl like that, so sheltered, so innocent. She hardly knows what's happening. Thomas isn't much of a man for consoling. Miss Marple said nothing, letting the conversation meander. Mrs. Allerton had a particular fondness for expressing her opinions on matters that required no opinion at all. And to think, Mrs. Allerton continued, the poor girl is set to inherit everything. It's no wonder she's been acting so strange. I hadn't realized she was inheriting anything, Miss Marple said, her voice soft. How so? Oh, didn't you know? Her late father left her the entire estate, along with a rather substantial sum of money. No wonder Thomas was so keen on marrying her. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly, her fingers lightly brushing a petal. Money is a very curious thing, isn't it? It brings a certain clarity to many people's actions. Mrs. Allerton pursed her lips. Oh, well, Thomas is a decent enough fellow, but one can't help but wonder. You don't suppose well, it's just that she doesn't quite look the same, does she? Who? Miss Marple asked, her voice almost a whisper, though she knew exactly who. Lucy, of course, Mrs. Allerton replied quickly. She's been acting so strangely, so unwell. I can't imagine she's sleeping well after all that's happened. But it's too much of a coincidence, isn't it? How convenient for her. The heir to a fortune, and now, well, perhaps we ought not to say more." Miss Marple looked up at Mrs. Allerton. "Perhaps not," she said calmly. "But it does raise an interesting question. Does anyone know why Lucy left so quickly the night of the dinner? No one seemed to see her go." Mrs. Allerton frowned. "Now that you mention it, no. I just assumed she had gone upstairs with Thomas. But she was so quiet, so withdrawn. It's hard to believe someone didn't see her leave." Miss Marple let the silence settle around them for a moment, her eyes on the flower beds. "Such a sensitive girl," she said gently. "But maybe it's time we paid a visit to Thomas himself, don't you think?" Later that afternoon, Miss Marple found herself at the Carraway estate, standing outside a large weathered stone house. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the manicured lawn, but the air felt uncomfortably still. Thomas Brabham greeted her with a cordiality that was almost too practised. "Miss Marple," he said, offering a stiff handshake. "How can I help you today?" "I thought I might have a word with you, Thomas," Miss Marple said, her voice calm, measured. "I was just wondering, did you happen to notice anything unusual the night of the dinner party? I mean, besides the weather, of course." Thomas's smile faltered for the briefest moment. "Unusual? Well, nothing unusual that I can think of. It was a pleasant evening, despite the distractions." He glanced away, his eyes briefly meeting Miss Marple's before looking toward the house. "A pleasant evening indeed," Miss Marple agreed, stepping closer to him. "But strange things have a way of hiding in plain sight, don't they? For example, I'm curious, did Lucy tell you anything that night? She seemed so withdrawn." Thomas shifted uncomfortably. "Lucy? She was upset, yes, but she's always been a sensitive soul. It wasn't anything serious, I assure you." Miss Marple's gaze softened, but her words were pointed. "Of course, but isn't it curious, Thomas? The way people behave when they're under pressure, when their future is suddenly threatened." Thomas's face went ashen, and Miss Marple noted the quick intake of breath. "What do you mean by that, Miss Marple?" he asked, his voice strained. "I'm not quite sure yet," Miss Marple said, her tone almost conversational. "But it does make one wonder why the heir to so much wealth would seem so anxious, wouldn't it?" Chapter 5. The Telltale. Watch by. Friday afternoon, the village had descended into a fever of speculation. The dinner party was quickly becoming the subject of every conversation, and a thread of suspicion wove through the streets, carrying with it the faint but unmistakable scent of scandal. But still, the police had not been called, and no formal investigation had been made. The truth of what had transpired the night of the dinner was still hidden in the folds of ambiguity. Miss Marple, however, had begun to assemble the fragments of the puzzle, and while the villagers gathered at the market to discuss the night's events, Miss Marple herself was quietly setting her own course, one that had begun with the tiniest of details. It was Saturday morning when she found the first piece of the puzzle, a simple thing hidden in plain sight. Miss Marple had returned to the Allertons' home, under the pretence of returning a dish she had borrowed the previous evening, but she was not interested in the dish. Instead, her gaze swept the hallway, and there it was, barely visible on the mantelpiece, a watch lying almost casually beside a photograph frame. The watch was an oddity, an antique piece with an intricate design, but one that did not quite match its setting. Most guests, Miss Marple knew, would have left their personal items in their rooms, not on the mantel where every eye could fall upon it. Yet this watch had been left behind, and Miss Marple could not dismiss the growing suspicion that it might belong to someone who had not intended for it to be found. She touched the watch carefully, her fingers running over the smooth surface. As she flipped it open, she paused. There, engraved on the inside of the case, were initials. They weren't Thomas Brabham's, nor were they the initials of anyone she had seen that night. The initials read, L.C. Lucy Carraway. A chill ran through her, though her expression remained unchanged. The watch had been abandoned in the Allertons' house, but Miss Marple had a nagging suspicion it had not been left there by mistake. She closed the watch slowly, as though placing the weight of the world back into its small frame, and set it gently back onto the mantelpiece. "Have you seen this before?" Miss Marple asked, her voice low as she turned to Mrs. Allerton, who had entered the room unnoticed. Mrs. Allerton's eyes flickered toward the watch, and she hesitated. "No, I can't say that I have," she replied, her voice flat. "It must have been left by one of the guests." "One of the guests," Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. "It's not every day that a watch gets left behind, especially such a beautiful one, and its owner wouldn't have been too pleased, I'm sure." Mrs. Allerton gave a forced laugh, though Miss Marple noted the faint tension in her shoulders. "No, I suppose not. But then accidents do happen." Miss Marple smiled, though the expression did not reach her eyes. "Accidents, yes, but it does. Make me wonder, Mrs. Allerton. What if this watch was left behind intentionally? What if it's a clue of some sort?" The air between them thickened. Mrs. Allerton's mouth opened slightly, but she said nothing more. Later that day, Miss Marple decided to pay another visit to Lucy Carraway. There was a hesitation in her step, a sense of uncertainty she hadn't felt before, but her instinct told her the watch was important. And so, after a brief exchange of pleasantries, Miss Marple sat across from Lucy, her sharp eyes taking in the young woman's dishevelled appearance. Lucy was pale, but there was a rigidity to her posture, a defence Miss Marple knew well. She had seen it in countless faces before, the outward show of composure masking something much deeper. "Lucy, dear," Miss Marple began gently, "I was at Fallow Ridge this morning. I found something that I believe belongs to you." Lucy looked up, her eyes wary. "What's that?" Miss Marple placed the watch on the table between them, letting the silence stretch between them. Lucy's eyes immediately flicked to the timepiece. There was no mistaking the recognition in her face, nor the quick flutter of her breath. "When it in, and sure be what? This yours?" Miss Marple asked softly. Lucy's hand reached out almost involuntarily, but she stopped short, her fingers curling slightly as if to pull away. "Yes," she whispered, barely audible. "I thought as much," Miss Marple said. "It's curious, isn't it? A watch like this, left in someone else's home. I wonder why it wasn't returned to you after the dinner party." Lucy's fingers trembled as she finally picked up the watch, holding it between her hands like a lifeline. I didn't even notice it was gone," she said, her voice strained. I didn't think it mattered. It's just a watch." Miss Marple regarded her carefully, noting the way Lucy's eyes darted to the side, her body tense. "But it does," matter, Lucy, doesn't it? When something so personal is left behind. It's a clue, isn't it?" Lucy opened her mouth to speak, but closed it quickly, her shoulders sagging in resignation. "Sometimes," Miss Marple continued softly, "the smallest things have the power to unravel the biggest mysteries, and I suspect this watch is more than just an accident." Chapter 6. The Secrets Beneath the Surface. The following day the village was still abuzz with the weight of what had transpired. The Allerton dinner party, once just a quaint social gathering, had transformed into the centre of a mystery no one dared to speak of openly, but everyone felt in their bones. The unease in the air had become palpable, like a storm pressing down on the horizon, promising something inevitable, though no one yet understood the shape of it. Miss Marple had taken her usual morning stroll, but today she felt the tension that had settled into the village more keenly. There was a new edge to the usual pleasantries exchanged over garden gates and shop counters. The polite smiles were no longer as genuine. The laughter at the pub, while louder, seemed forced. Her visit to the Carraway estate had left her with a troubling sense of certainty. Lucy Carraway's response to the watch had been telling. It wasn't just the watch that concerned Miss Marple. It was Lucy's reaction. She had been on the brink of saying something when she stopped herself. There was guilt in the young woman's eyes, a fear she could not conceal, and Miss Marple knew that the truth was just out of reach, buried under layers of deception. But if Lucy was hiding something, then so were others. Miss Marple made her way to the Allerton estate later that afternoon, where a different kind of conversation awaited. She was greeted by Mrs. Allerton, who, though polite, seemed distracted. The house was quieter than usual, and a subtle tension hung in the air. Mrs. Allerton's smile was thin, and her eyes flickered nervously as she ushered Miss Marple inside. "I do hope I'm not interrupting anything," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but probing. "Oh, no, not at all, Miss Marple," Mrs. Allerton replied quickly, though the urgency in her tone suggested otherwise. "It's just, well, it's been a difficult few days, hasn't it? So much uncertainty. And with Lucy still in such a state, I hardly know what to think." Miss Marple nodded, not missing the way Mrs. Allerton's hands twisted together. "Yes, the poor dear seems quite affected. I had a chance to speak with her this morning. She's not in a good way." Mrs. Allerton's lips tightened at the mention of Lucy's name. "It's terribly unfortunate, but I fear it's all a bit much for her to handle. You know how it is with young girls. Impressionable, easily overwhelmed. I do wish Thomas would take more of an active role in caring for her." Miss O'Chain, Marple watched her closely, noting the way Mrs. Allerton avoided looking directly at her. "But surely, Mrs. Allerton, a young woman in her situation is under far more pressure than any of us can imagine. The weight of expectation, of family legacy, perhaps even a little more." Mrs. Allerton's eyes flicked nervously to the door, as though considering whether someone else might be listening. She leaned in slightly, her voice lowering. "You're right, of course. But you must understand, Miss Marple, Thomas is not what he seems." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean by that?" Mrs. Allerton hesitated, her gaze flickering toward the study door. "Oh, I shouldn't speak of it, really. It's not my place. But there's something about Thomas Brabham that doesn't sit well with me. I've known him for years, you see, and I've always gotten the sense that there's something, how do I say it, something he's hiding. It's always been there, just beneath the surface." "Something hidden?" Miss Marple asked, intrigued. "How so?" "I'm not sure, but when Lucy and Thomas first became engaged, I noticed a change in him. He became more guarded, more distant. It wasn't just the usual anxiety that comes with marriage. No, it was something else." Mrs. Allerton looked at Miss Marple, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "I think he wants something from Lucy, and I don't believe it's love." Miss Marple didn't speak immediately. Instead, she watched Mrs. Allerton carefully, noting the hesitation, the fear that flashed in her eyes before she could hide it. "You've seen something, haven't you?" Miss Marple said gently. "Perhaps something you're not telling me." Mrs. Allerton's face flushed, but she said nothing for a moment. Then, with a sigh, she spoke again, her voice quieter. "It's not my place to say anything more, Miss Marple. But Thomas was at the house late one night, before the dinner. I didn't see him leave, but I know I heard the sound of something being moved in the study. The same night that Lucy seemed so upset. When I confronted him the next day, he acted as though nothing had happened, but I saw him slip something into his coat pocket. I couldn't make it out, but I could tell it was something important." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "Did you see what it was?" "No, I didn't," Mrs. Allerton replied quickly. "But I swear, Miss Marple, it was the same night. The same night that the door had opened on its own, and the wind blew through the house. I'm certain of it." "Tell me, Mrs. Allerton," Miss Marple said quietly, her voice sharpening. "What was it about that night that made you so certain?" Mrs. Allerton paused. "Because, Miss Marple, the night was not right. It felt like something was waiting." Chapter 7. The Shattered Mirror. The afternoon air was crisp and clear, but the tension in the village seemed to tighten with every passing hour. News had begun to spread about Lucy Carraway, her increasingly erratic behaviour, and her withdrawal from the people around her. And with it, rumours swirled about the mysterious events surrounding the Allerton dinner. Yet, amid all the chatter, Miss Marple could not shake the gnawing sense that the pieces were still not quite fitting together. She had spent the morning at the vicarage, listening to Reverend Chudley's rather rambling sermon on forgiveness, though her thoughts had not strayed far from the watch, the look in Lucy's eyes, and Mrs. Allerton's cryptic admission about Thomas. It was all there, just within reach, but the threads were tangled, and Miss Marple needed something to pull them free. The twist came unexpectedly that afternoon. Miss Marple had barely returned to her cottage when a soft knock on her door startled her. Opening it, she found an anxious-looking young man standing before her, his eyes darting nervously as he held a letter in his hand. "Miss Marple?" the young man asked, his voice tight. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I believe you need to see this." She took the letter without hesitation and tore open the envelope. As she unfolded the paper, she immediately saw that it was a note, hastily written in a scrawling hand. It read, "Miss Marple, please come to the Carraway estate at once. There's been an incident. I didn't know who else to turn to. TB, the handwriting was unmistakable, Thomas Brabham's. And though the words seemed simple enough, there was an undeniable urgency in the letter that sent a shiver through Miss Marple. She didn't waste a moment. She knew better than to wait. Without a word, she grabbed her shawl and headed for the Carraway estate. When she arrived, the estate looked as peaceful as ever. The large house stood against the backdrop of a slowly setting sun, its windows reflecting the fading light. But as Miss Marple approached the front door, a sense of foreboding settled over her. Thomas was waiting for her in the hallway, his face pale and drawn. He appeared as though he had been pacing for hours, and when he saw Miss Marple, he stepped forward with a desperate, almost frantic energy. "Miss Marple," he began, his voice trembling, "thank you for coming. You've got to help me. Something terrible has happened." "What is it, Thomas?" Miss Marple asked, her voice calm but firm, her mind already whirring with the possibilities. "It's Lucy," he said, his eyes wide with fear. She's gone. I found her in the garden, lying beside the broken greenhouse. She wasn't breathing. There's blood, Miss Marple, blood everywhere." Miss Marple took in the news without reaction, her mind processing the words carefully. "Where is she now?" "She's inside," Thomas replied, his hands shaking. "But it doesn't make sense. It looks like she fell. But I don't know how. There was nothing to cause her to fall. No one was around her. It was just... I don't understand, Miss Marple. You have to help me." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze never leaving his face. There was something in his eyes, something that didn't quite match his words. But she said nothing, merely followed him through the house to the garden. The scene in the garden was as grim as Thomas had described. Lucy lay motionless on the ground, her body partially covered by the broken remnants of the greenhouse. Blood stained the earth around her, and her eyes were closed, her expression serene, as though she were merely sleeping. But the scene itself was far from peaceful. Miss Marple approached Lucy carefully, kneeling beside her. She noted the position of her body and the lack of any clear injury that might have caused such a fatal fall. It didn't make sense, the sound of footsteps approached from behind. Miss Marple stood up and turned to see Mrs. Carraway, her face pale and tear-streaked, standing at the door. She had clearly heard the commotion. "What happened?" she asked softly, though Miss Marple could see the strain in her eyes. "Is Lucy dead?" "Mrs. Carraway, I'm afraid your daughter has suffered a terrible accident," Miss Marple said gently. "But something doesn't quite add up. I believe there is more to this than a simple fall." Mrs. Carraway's face contorted with grief. "What do you mean? Lucy couldn't have... She was fine yesterday. She..." Just then Miss Marple's eyes fell upon the shattered pieces of glass scattered across the garden floor. The greenhouse was completely destroyed, but there was something strange about the way the shards were arranged. They weren't scattered randomly. No, someone had been deliberate. "Look at this," Miss Marple said, stepping closer to the broken glass. "It's too neat. The pieces of glass are almost as though they were placed here." Thomas stepped forward, his expression confused. "I don't understand. How could anyone—" "Someone wanted to make this look like an accident," Miss Marple murmured, kneeling to examine the glass more closely. "But it wasn't." She stood up slowly, her eyes narrowing as she turned toward Thomas. "You know something, don't you?" Thomas's face went white, and for the first time Miss Marple saw a flicker of something she had not expected: guilt. Before she could say anything further, a voice called from the doorway. "I think it's time we all spoke honestly, don't you?" Miss Marple turned sharply to see Mrs. Allerton standing at the entrance to the garden, her face pale and resolute. Chapter 8. The Final Move. The air in the garden seemed to thicken as Mrs. Allerton stepped forward, her face a study of calm control. The words she spoke were measured, but there was a steely edge to them. "I believe," she began, her voice cutting through the tension, "it's time for us to have a real conversation about what happened here, about what happened that night, Thomas." Brabham looked at her, his face draining of colour. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice tight, barely above a whisper. Miss Marple stood quietly, watching the exchange, allowing the silence to stretch before she spoke. "Yes, Mrs. Allerton, I believe we're all ready for some clarity. After all, there are only so many secrets one can keep before they begin to spill out." Mrs. Allerton turned toward Miss Marple, her eyes flickering with a quiet intensity. "I knew the night of the dinner that something wasn't right. It wasn't just the way Lucy was acting, or the strange noises in the house. It was—" She paused, taking a breath, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "It was Thomas." At the mention of his name, Thomas's face twisted with a mixture of disbelief and rising panic. "What do you mean by that?" he asked, his voice rising. "I don't know what you think you're suggesting, but you're wrong." "Oh, I don't think I'm wrong, Thomas," Mrs. Allerton said, her words deliberate. "The night of the Eid Sheikh dinner, I saw you just after Lucy had gone upstairs. You were in the study, weren't you?" I was not," Thomas stammered, clearly caught off guard. His eyes darted to Miss Marple, but she remained silent, watching him with unwavering attention. Mrs. Allerton continued, her voice low but firm. "I saw you, Thomas, and I saw you take something from the desk. I couldn't see exactly what it was, but I know it wasn't yours." Thomas's breath hitched, and Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. She had been observing him closely, and the flicker of guilt that passed over his face confirmed her suspicions. He was hiding something, and the time had come for him to confront it. Miss Marple stepped forward, her tone gentle, but unyielding. "You see, Thomas, it's the smallest things that betray us. A glance, a pause, an innocent gesture that, in hindsight, reveals much more. Like the watch. Did you know, when I first saw it, I didn't immediately connect it to you? But as the pieces fell into place, the truth became clearer." Thomas opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His gaze shifted, as though seeking an escape, but the garden seemed to close in on him. "You didn't know the watch belonged to Lucy, did you?" Miss Marple asked, her voice quiet, like a thread being pulled from a tapestry. "But when you saw it on the mantel, you knew instantly who it belonged to. And then you realized you'd made a mistake, because if it was hers, then it tied you to her in a way you hadn't planned on." He swallowed, his face growing paler with each word. No, that's not, but it is," Miss Marple continued, her voice now sharp with clarity. "You thought if you left the watch behind, it would seem like Lucy had simply forgotten it, a perfect misdirection. But it didn't work, did it? Because Mrs. Allerton saw you that night. You weren't just in the study, were you, Thomas? You were in a place you shouldn't have been." Thomas's hands clenched at his sides, his face twisted in frustration, but behind the anger was something else. Fear. "I don't know what you're trying to say, Miss Marple," he said, his voice trembling. "This is ridiculous. I didn't—" "Don't you see, Thomas?" Miss Marple interjected, her voice low but full of finality. "You thought you could get away with it, but Lucy was the key, wasn't she? She knew something she wasn't supposed to know, something that would have ruined everything for you." His shoulders sagged slightly, and Miss Marple could see the change in him. The last remnants of denial were evaporating, leaving only the raw truth beneath. "Tell me, Thomas," Miss Marple said, her voice softer now, as though she were coaxing the truth from him like a reluctant confession. "How did it feel to realize that Lucy had become a threat to you?" "I didn't," Thomas began, but his words faltered. He looked at Mrs. Allerton, and then at Lucy's body, lying still in the garden. And in that moment, the facade cracked. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," he muttered, his voice breaking. "I never meant for her to die. I just needed her out of the way, just for a little while. But she kept asking questions, kept getting too close." Miss Marple's eyes widened with understanding, but she didn't interrupt. She let him continue. "It was meant to be a simple accident," Thomas confessed, his voice shaking. "I thought if I could just scare her enough, frighten her into silence, it would all be over. But Lucy, she was too clever. She saw through me, and then she knew." He dropped his head, defeated, and Miss Marple could see the weight of his guilt pressing down on him. "It wasn't supposed to end like this," he whispered again. Mrs. Allerton took a step forward, her expression unreadable. "You killed her, Thomas. You knew what she was on to, and you couldn't let her ruin everything you had planned." Thomas turned toward her, his eyes wild with panic. "I didn't mean to. Everything was falling apart, and I couldn't let her destroy it." Miss Marple nodded, her expression calm but resolute. "You were so focused on covering your tracks, Thomas, that you failed to see what was right in front of you. The truth always has a way of coming to light, even when we think we've buried it." The silence between them stretched long, filled only by the rustling of the wind through the trees. Thomas Brabham, now completely broken, sank to his knees. In defeat. Chapter 9. The Final Truth. The garden had fallen unnaturally quiet, the only sound the rustle of the leaves in the breeze. Miss Marple stood tall, her hands folded neatly in front of her, as she observed Thomas Brabham kneeling before her. His confession had left an air of finality hanging over the scene, as though a door had been closed forever. Mrs. Allerton remained, silent, watching her nephew with a mixture of disbelief and quiet satisfaction. Miss Marple had never been one for grand gestures or dramatic confrontations. She preferred to let the truth unfold in its own time, to let it reveal itself through the smallest of actions, the most subtle of clues. And now, in the midst of the stillness, she knew it was time to make everything clear. "Thomas," Miss Marple said softly, her voice steady, "I believe you've admitted to your part in Lucy's death, but there's something more that you need to understand. This wasn't just a moment of fear or panic. This was a carefully calculated move, wasn't it?" Thomas's head lifted slightly, his eyes clouded with guilt and terror. "I didn't mean for it to happen like this," he whispered, almost pleading. "It was supposed to be a warning, a scare, just to get her to back off." "You never meant to kill her," Miss Marple continued, her voice calm. "But you knew that sooner or later you would have to deal with Lucy if she discovered what you were hiding. You couldn't allow her to expose you, could you?" Mrs. Allerton stepped forward, her voice cutting through the tension. "But Thomas, that night, when you slipped something into your pocket, it wasn't just about silencing Lucy. You were trying to cover up something much bigger, weren't you?" Thomas's gaze flickered toward Mrs. Allerton, his expression one of disbelief. He opened his mouth to speak but stopped short, as if unsure of how to justify his actions any longer. "You see," Miss Marple said, her eyes narrowing, "the broken glass in the garden, the way it was arranged, it wasn't an accident. It was meant to look like Lucy had fallen, as if she had been the victim of some unfortunate misstep. But it wasn't an accident. It was staged to cover up a much darker truth." "Staged?" Thomas repeated, his voice trembling. "I didn't—" "You thought you could manipulate the scene to your advantage," Miss Marple said, interrupting him gently. "But the truth is, Lucy wasn't the only one who had been investigating. You were too. And that's where you made your mistake." She paused, letting her words settle. "The night of the dinner, when you were in the study. What were you doing, Thomas? You weren't just waiting for Lucy to come upstairs, were you? You were covering your tracks. You knew the watch was missing, and you knew that if Lucy found it, everything would come crashing down." Thomas's face paled, and he swallowed hard, his hands clenched tightly at his sides. "But there's something even more important here," Miss Marple continued, her gaze intense. "It wasn't just the watch, or even the way Lucy had begun to ask questions. It was the fact that Lucy had discovered something far worse, something that you couldn't allow anyone to know." A tense silence followed her words. Thomas shifted uneasily, his eyes darting toward the house, then back to Miss Marple, but no words came. "You were part of something much larger, Thomas," Miss Marple said softly, almost as though she were speaking to herself. "A secret that you'd been keeping, one that Lucy had uncovered. It was only a matter of time before she started putting the pieces together, and that terrified you." Thomas opened his mouth, his voice shaking with panic. "I didn't— No, that's not it." Miss Marple turned to Mrs. Allerton, her tone gentle but final. "You knew, didn't you? You saw it in Thomas's eyes that night. You knew he was hiding something, and you suspected it had to do with Lucy. But you couldn't prove it. Not until now." Mrs. Allerton's eyes remained locked on Thomas, her expression unreadable. Slowly, she nodded. "Yes, I knew. I didn't want to believe it, but I knew." Thomas trembled. "Please, please, you have to understand, I didn't—" "You never meant for it to go this far, did you?" Miss Marple said, her voice softening. "But once Lucy found out about the money, about the family secret you were protecting, there was no turning back, was there?" Thomas's face twisted in anguish. "It wasn't just about the money. It was about everything. The business, the estate. Lucy had no idea how dangerous it was. I couldn't let her ruin it all." Miss Marple shook her head slowly, her expression sombre. "You didn't realize, did you, that your fear of losing everything only drove you to make the mistake that would cost you your freedom. And Lucy, poor Lucy, who was just trying to help, ended up paying the price. Thomas's shoulders slumped as the weight of the truth bore down on him. "I didn't mean to," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Miss Marple turned to Mrs. Allerton, then back to Thomas. "The truth always finds a way to reveal itself, and today it has come to light." The silence that followed felt different now. The weight of the confession, the unspoken truths, hung heavy in the air. For all of Thomas Brabham's attempts to cover his tracks, the final reckoning had come, and there was no escaping the consequences. Mrs. Allerton remained standing, her face a mask of quiet resignation. "I never wanted this," she said softly, almost to herself. "But I knew it was coming." "Sometimes," Miss Marple said gently, "the past can be a very difficult thing to outrun." Chapter 10. The Quiet Reflection, the Village of Nether, chipping, ever serene in its daily rhythms, began to return to its routine in the days following the revelation of the truth. Yet, beneath the surface of casual greetings and familiar faces, something had irrevocably changed. The lightness that once filled the air seemed heavier now, like the stillness before a storm, except, of course, the storm had already passed. Thomas Brabham had been taken into custody the morning after his confession, though no one had seen him leave the Carraway estate. He had been remarkably silent, only speaking when necessary, his gaze downcast. The police, once called to the scene, had followed through the formalities, but it was Miss Marple's quiet insight and gentle persistence that had truly uncovered the truth. In the days that followed, the villagers spoke of nothing else. At the market, the post office, and even during the vicar's Sunday sermon, whispers swirled. They spoke of the murder, the tragic death of Lucy Carraway, and the dark family secrets that had led to it. But despite the shared horror, there was a palpable relief. The truth had emerged, and now the village could begin to move on. On the afternoon of Thomas's arraignment, Miss Marple sat quietly in her front parlour, her knitting resting on her lap. She had been awaiting a visitor for some time now. The knock on her door was soft but insistent, and when she opened it, there stood Mrs. Allerton, her face pale but composed. "I hope I'm not interrupting, Miss Marple," Mrs. Allerton said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Her voice was quiet, but there was a sharpness to it. "I wanted to speak to you. To thank you, I suppose." Miss Marple nodded, guiding her into the sitting-room. "You're very welcome, Mrs. Allerton. But I believe it was the truth that led to everything being uncovered, not me. I simply helped it along." Mrs. Allerton smiled weakly. "Yes, well, I'm not sure what else I can say. The truth is always so difficult to swallow, isn't it?" Miss Marple took her seat, folding her hands neatly in her lap. "It is. But you have faced it, and in doing so, you've freed yourself from its weight. And that, I suppose, is all one can do." The silence between them stretched briefly before Mrs. Allerton spoke again. "I've spent the last few days trying to make sense of it all, of what Thomas did. He was always so charming, so polite, and yet there was something in him, wasn't there? Something hidden beneath the surface." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes soft but knowing. "There often is, Mrs. Allerton. People reveal themselves through their actions, even when their words suggest otherwise. Mrs. Allerton sighed deeply, sitting down on the chair across from Miss Marple. I knew, you know, not exactly what he was up to, but I knew he was hiding something. I just never thought it would go this far. I thought... She stopped herself, shaking her head. I should have done more. I should have seen it. You did what you could, Miss Marple said, her voice gentle. Sometimes the truth has a way of remaining hidden until it's too late. Mrs. Allerton glanced down at her hands, clasped tightly together. What about Lucy? What should I have done for her? You couldn't have saved her from what she uncovered, Miss Marple said softly. She was brave, in her own way, but sometimes the weight of the truth is too much for anyone to bear, especially when it's not their own to carry. Mrs. Allerton nodded slowly, her eyes distant. She never knew how much I wanted to protect her. I thought I could shield her from the world, from everything. But she was already looking too closely. Miss Marple studied her for a moment before speaking again. We all have our secrets, Mrs. Allerton. Some are lighter than others. But there comes a time when the truth must be faced, no matter the cost. You did what you could for Lucy, but she was bound by a truth that was not of her making. The room was silent again, each woman lost in her own thoughts. Finally, Mrs. Allerton stood, smoothing her dress. I suppose there's nothing more to say, is there? Everything's been said, and the village will go on, just as it always does. Miss Marple stood as well, her movements slow and deliberate. The village will go on, yes, but things are never quite the same after something like this. Even if the world forgets, the people who lived through it will remember. Mrs. Allerton nodded. I suppose you're right. Thank you, Miss Marple. I don't know what I would have done without your guidance. Miss Marple smiled, the kindness in her eyes still as sharp as ever. One only needs to be patient, Mrs. Allerton. Sometimes the answers are waiting, hidden in plain sight. As Mrs. Allerton left, Miss Marple remained standing by the window, her eyes resting on the quiet village outside. She had watched the events unfold, and now she could see how the ripples of one tragedy had spread through the lives of so many. The village would heal, but there would always be a shadow over it, a reminder of the secrets that had been kept and the truths that had been uncovered. It was a quiet, unsettling peace that settled over Miss Marple as she returned to her chair, resuming her knitting. She knew that for all her understanding of human nature, some mysteries would never truly fade away. But that was the nature of life, always evolving, always changing, but never completely free from the past. And so, with the mystery now laid to rest, Miss Marple could only reflect on the quiet strength of the people around her, their secrets, their fears, and their occasional need for a little guidance along the way. Chapter 11. The Quiet End. The days that followed had a peculiar calmness about them. The whirlwind of revelations, of guilt and betrayal, had receded, and in its wake the village of Nether Chipping seemed to settle back into its old rhythm. The conversations that had once been laced with whispers of scandal and suspicion now turned to more mundane topics. The weather, the upcoming harvest festival, and the vicar's plans for the next Sunday service. Miss Marple had resumed her usual, quiet routine. She sat by the window in her cosy sitting room, her knitting still in her hands, her thoughts elsewhere. The puzzle of Thomas Brabham, of Lucy Carraway, and of the tangled lives that had all collided in that one night, was now resolved. Yet, as always, the quiet aftermath of a mystery left Miss Marple with a lingering sense of reflection. It was a Sunday morning when Miss Marple received the letter, an envelope with an elegant script and the seal of the Carraway estate. She opened it slowly, her fingers lightly brushing the paper. The contents were brief, but the message was clear. Dear Miss Marple, I hope this letter finds you well. I wanted to express my deepest gratitude for your guidance in this unfortunate affair. Though the circumstances have been tragic, I am finally able to make sense of everything. Lucy's death was not in vain. She uncovered the truth, and for that I will be forever grateful. Sincerely, Sarah Carraway. Miss Marple sat back, letting the words sink in. The letter was simple, almost too simple, but there was an honesty in Sarah Carraway's words that Miss Marple appreciated. The family, though scarred by the tragedy, would now begin to heal. They would find a way to move on. She set the letter down and looked out the window, her eyes lingering on the peaceful landscape. It was a scene that, for all its calm beauty, now carried the weight of hidden truths. The village, too, had endured its share of darkness, but it had always found a way to emerge into the light. As the afternoon wore on, Miss Marple received another visitor, Reverend Chudley. His gait was slow, his steps heavy, and as he entered her sitting room, she could see the weariness in his eyes. He had not yet come to terms with everything, she knew. Miss Marple, he said, his voice low, I've been thinking about it, about everything. You were right, of course. The truth always has a way of coming to light, even if it takes longer than we expect. Miss Marple nodded, her gaze steady. The truth, Reverend, is rarely kind, but it has a way of setting us free eventually. He sighed deeply and sat down across from her, his hands clasped together in front of him. I've been praying for Thomas, for all of them really. It's hard to understand, but I think I've come to see the truth for what it is. And I think they'll find a way to heal in time. I believe they will, Miss Marple said softly. But it takes time and understanding. Most people never fully understand their own motivations until it's too late. But in this case, they were fortunate. The truth came to light before too much more damage could be done. Reverend Chudley looked out the window, his gaze thoughtful. I suppose you're right. It's a shame it had to come to this. I know Lucy's passing has shaken everyone. She was so young, and her life cut short so needlessly. But perhaps in some way it was meant to happen. She saw something others did not, and in doing so, she brought the truth to the surface. Miss Marple did not respond immediately. Her thoughts wandered briefly to the young woman, Lucy Carraway, who had been caught in a web far too complex for her to untangle alone. She had been brave, yes, but, as always, the price of truth was often far higher than anyone anticipated. Village will be quieter now, Miss Marple said after a moment, breaking the silence between them. The mystery is resolved, but the memories will linger. Some people will move on more easily than others. Reverend Chudley nodded. Yes, but there will always be a shadow, a reminder of what happened here. And that is often the way of it, Miss Marple replied. her voice soft, almost reflective. Some shadows never quite fade, no matter how bright the sun. The conversation tapered off, and Miss Marple felt the weight of it settle into the room. She didn't mind the quiet, though. It was familiar, and in its stillness there was a certain peace. As Reverend Chudley took his leave, Miss Marple sat back in her chair, the evening sun casting a soft glow across the room. She looked out at the village once more, her thoughts drifting back to the events of the past weeks. It had all been so unexpected, so wrapped in confusion and fear. Yet now, as the village slowly began to heal, Miss Marple felt a quiet satisfaction. The mystery had unravelled as it always did, and the truth had emerged like a thread in the dark, bringing with it the light of understanding. In the end, that was all one could hope for. Truth, no matter how painful, always had a way of clearing the fog and allowing the world to see itself more clearly. And for all the darkness that had passed through nether chipping, Miss Marple knew that in time the village would find its way back to peace. For now, though, there was only silence, a silence that felt earned. Chapter 12. The Echo of Silence. As autumn settled over nether chipping, the final remnants of summer's warmth faded into the crisp, cool air. The village, ever steady and unyielding, returned to its familiar routines. The trees stood bare now, their leaves scattered across the cobbled streets, a quiet testament to the passage of time, and life, as it so often did after a storm, resumed its rhythm, a little quieter, a little more contemplative. Miss Marple sat at her usual spot by the window, her knitting resting beside her as she looked out over the village. She had always enjoyed this view, this simple perspective on life as it unfolded before her. The same streets, the same houses, the same people. But even in the most unchanging of places, things could shift in ways one could never predict. It had been a week since Thomas Brabham's confession, and while the village had already begun to move on, the echoes of the events that transpired still lingered. For Miss Marple, the mystery had come to its natural conclusion, but she knew, better than most, that some questions could never be fully answered. Her thoughts drifted back to Lucy Carroway, the young woman whose courage had brought the truth to light, even at the cost of her own life. Lucy had been a mirror, reflecting the darkness that had existed in the hearts of those around her, a reminder that some truths were not meant to be hidden. But she had paid a heavy price for that knowledge, one that no one should ever have to bear. The letter from Sarah Carroway had been simple, but its message was clear. The family would survive, as families often did. But Miss Marple couldn't help but wonder if the scars left behind would ever fully heal. The doorbell rang softly, pulling Miss Marple from her musings. She stood and walked slowly to the door, her steps light but steady. When she opened it, she found Reverend Chudley standing on the threshold, his face as solemn as ever. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple," he said, his voice carrying the weight of recent events. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all, Reverend," Miss Marple replied, stepping aside to let him in. "I was just thinking over the past few days. How strange it all feels now that it's over. Not quite real, somehow." "I know what you mean," he said, following her into the sitting room. "It's as though the world has shifted beneath us, and now we're left at trying to find our balance again. But perhaps it's best this way. The truth has come to light and the darkness is no longer hiding." Miss Marple nodded as she poured them both a cup of tea. "Yes, but sometimes it's the small things that stay with us, the details we overlook, the things we don't want to see. They linger, don't they?" Reverend Chudley sat down across from her, his hands folded in his lap. "Yes, they do. And it's those lingering thoughts that often haunt us the most." Marple took a sip of her tea, her eyes turning to the window. "I was thinking about Lucy," she said quietly. "She saw something no one else could. She wasn't afraid to ask the questions others avoided. But it cost her everything." Reverend Chudley's expression softened. "She was brave, more than I think even she realized." Miss Marple looked back at him, a faint smile on her lips. "Yes, and perhaps that's why it's so important for the rest of us to keep asking those questions, even when it's difficult, even when the answers may not be what we want to hear." The room was quiet for a moment, the sound of the ticking clock filling the space between them. "I've been thinking," Miss Marple continued, "about how the village will move on. It always does, doesn't it? The seasons change, and the people carry on with their lives. But sometimes, even in a place like this, the smallest things can have the largest impact." Reverend Chudley nodded thoughtfully. "Yes, it's a reminder that we never truly know what's going on beneath the surface of things. We look at our neighbours, our friends, and we think we understand them. But we don't always see the secrets they carry." Miss Marple set her cup down and leaned back in her chair, her gaze thoughtful. "Perhaps that's why I watch, Reverend. I don't just see people as they appear. I see the stories behind their eyes, the stories they aren't telling." He smiled faintly. "And you always know how to read them, Miss Marple. It's a gift, one I think you've used well." For a moment, Miss Marple was quiet, her thoughts far away. Then she spoke again, her voice almost a whisper. "I think we're all just waiting for the next story to unfold, the next mystery to solve. It's the nature of life, isn't it? Always changing, always moving, but never quite the same." Reverend Chudley nodded, his eyes filled with understanding. Yes, it's never quite the same, and that's what makes it worth living. As the afternoon light began to fade, casting long shadows across the room, Miss Marple turned back to the window. The village outside was peaceful, as it always was, but she knew that behind each closed door, behind each smile, there was another story waiting to be told. And though she might not always be there to uncover it, Miss Marple knew she would always be watching, waiting for the next mystery to reveal itself.